Whenever we review something popular, whether it's music, art, fashion, or anything in between, we tend to put it on a pedestal simply because it's popular. That's why today I'm going to explain why I don't think Ed Blonde, Starboy, and 2014 Forest Hills Drive are all that good. Before we get into the actual albums though, I really want to dig into why I think this idea of popularity can greatly affect a product in so many different ways. I'm asking, why do we do this? You could say that the idea of something being popular is almost like an addiction. We see something that's supposedly so far ahead of something else, which immediately puts our mind in a mode that wants to engage with it. And the more popular something is, the more we crave to get to it. Like I said before, this is true for so many things. Whether it's a movie like Dune or a fashion trend like, I don't know, baggy jeans, people automatically assume it's superior to its competitors in some sort of way due to this idea of popularity. I think it boils down to the natural human behavior to want to be better than something in order to stand out in a sea of billions. So back to the album. Today, I want to dive into why these three albums create a popularity trap and why so many people seem to glaze them and make them out for more than they really are. As Tyler, the Creator, puts it,
you know what annoys me when people are like, "This is my top five," and people argue it. Like, you got 17-year-olds like, "Yeah, like, dude, fucking Ready to Die and Enter the Wu-Tang is my top 10 album ever." I'm like, bro, you just got hair on your dick. You got young boys and babies out here, and that's your favorite. Like, I don't care about people's objective top nothing. Tell me what is your favorite shit, because you learn so much from people.
I think this is such an important take because it seems like all too often people automatically just want to say something that the majority of people like in order to want to fit in, which ultimately leads to an oversaturated mess of people essentially just glazing top-rated music for nothing. I also agree with him saying, I want to hear what your favorite albums are, because it seems like literally everyone is saying the same thing. And I think that would be a lot more beneficial if everybody were to share what they actually like instead of what the majority of people like, as it would give a more varied view of why those pieces of music are actually meaningful to people. I just want to preface this and say that I don't think these albums are straight out bad. I just want to take a sort of controversial take and explain why I think these are conflicting and have sort of fallen victim to glazing in a sense. With that said, let's get into the albums. Despite what other people might say, like these three albums have changed music and their respective genres forever, I simply don't think that's the case. I think in order for that to fully happen, something has to be so monumental and so dystopian from what its predecessor was and set up future music for decades in order to be fully considered a game-changing piece of music. For example, recently I've really been enjoying Mixtape Pluto by Future, and let's say I were to say that this album is going to change rap music forever, or I've never heard anything like this before. It just simply wouldn't be true, because countless people have been doing what Future has been doing for years, including himself. Really, he's just making solid, heavy-hitting trap music on this project. It's like something we've seen before, and while it's not bad at all, it's just not different. On the other hand, if I were to say something like Illmatic changed rap forever, then that'd be a different story, because it further introduced sampling into rap, which we hear so much of in rap nowadays, which makes it safe to say that it was an influential album in the history of hip-hop music. I think this methodology applies to all three of these. You could connect Starboy to Michael Jackson, Blonde to Stevie Wonder, and 2014 Forest Hills Drive to Nas, all of which have been doing it before them. So, what makes these albums from these three people so much more popular than the others? There are a ton of factors that could be considered to be the main reason, but if we're talking about a concrete sole reason, I would say that it's hits, production, and the feeling that these albums give off. All of these albums have hit songs that have drawn in listeners that previously may have never heard of these artists before. The reason I think these albums could be considered meh in a very controversial light is that they don't change a lot of what they build off of. The hits are sort of engineered to go viral and promote the entire album, and some of the production really doesn't live up to what it's really hyped up to be. I don't think they bring enough to the table to be considered albums that have changed music that a lot of people seem to claim they are. Yes, the songs are good, and some songs are great, but the foundations that they're built off of wouldn't be there if it weren't for the music that came before, and what these artists have done with their albums in the grand scheme of things isn't all that different from what everybody else is doing. Let's take a look at each of the albums individually. Let's start with Starboy. I feel like this project was engineered in order to push The Weeknd into the mainstream. As one of his first attempts into a full pop album, I would say that Starboy is a solid project as far as listenability goes. However, at its very core, Starboy is an R&B album. Here's where I think Tyler's take comes in. I think that people think that this album is like the magnum opus of pop and R&B albums, and this is one of the albums that defined the past decade. And while it didn't really break any sort of new major ground, it did have some staple hits, and that's why I feel like people are obligated to put it in every top list. I simply don't think it has to be included there. Those songs lean more pop like Starboy and I Feel It Coming. Other songs really dive into that slow, soulful production that R&B is notoriously known for, like On Attention and Nothing Without You, where the songs mainly deal with themes of love, heartbreak, and attraction. Though a lot of these songs do sound good, when we take a deeper look into the content of the album, I think this is where they fall short in some aspects. After hearing about the same heartbreak told in different ways in the 15th song, it can start to get old. I'm not saying that every song on here sounds the same, but there are a lot of themes of typical R&B here that I feel could be tapped into to really explore its potential more. No glaze. Take a song like Love to Lay, for example. I really like this song, and I think this sort of sound could be leaned into more on this album, as I think The Weeknd really shines when it comes to pop or synth pop, as his voice has a sort of captivating effect that really fits with the genre. Despite R&B sometimes being called a dying genre, this album, made in 2016, is the second most streamed R&B album of all time, only behind his own After Hours album. Compare this to something like Anderson .Paak's Malibu, which while it was very successful, was nowhere near the smash hit Billboard breaking success that Starboy has reached. The reason that these songs had started to pick up exponentially more traction than other R&B albums at the time was because The Weeknd engineered all of these songs to be hits and took what he could from R&B and pop to create the most viral effect on these songs that he could. So if we really break down Starboy, it just goes to show what The Weeknd is doing isn't all that genius. He just blended what he thought would work combined with his rising popularity at the time. It hit at the right moment in order to create an album that, while it has its high points, is not all that game-changing in the grand scope of things. Alright, let's talk about Blonde. I also want to preface this that in no way is this album straight out bad. In fact, I think it's a very powerful and transformative album, but I think elements of it take away from it and diminish its overall influence. I would say Blonde is primarily a combination of R&B, indie rock, and pop. Frank Ocean uses this album to explore love, masculinity, and sexuality. Using R&B, Frank managed to create a compelling and dynamic album that allows him to explore all of these themes that blend together into a very cohesive and powerful album that resonates with many. I think though that one of the downfalls of this album is the fact that while some of the content is very meaningful, the actual production on some areas of this project doesn't do it justice. At points, sounds slow and sleepy, which I don't think fits all the things he's trying to express. Let's take a song like Good Guy, for example. While we were introduced to that tone that Frank wanted to set in the beginning of the album, a slow and thoughtful tone, I think that once this tracklist hits the Good Guy point, it can start to become monotonous and the message can be lost. Since the song is about his love life and how hard it can be to get to know and love someone, I think he could have done something where it sounded happier but had a darker underlying meaning that could have provided a more subtle yet powerful meaning and sound to the song. Now, I'm not saying that somebody would completely lose interest here, but I think it can take away from the overall value that Frank is trying to provide here. Despite this, I think that other songs like Nights and Pretty Sweet do a much better job at capturing this feeling of empowerment and or love. I also think that he does a fantastic job at expressing himself in these songs, and that's not what I'm here to critique. I'm just saying that if you were to express some of these things in a slightly different tone or mood, they may come across better. Though highly regarded by many, and though it may be a stretch, Blonde could be considered meh from a very critical standpoint. From mood, lyrics, and framing, this album does have some issues that could bring down its overall listenability down. And finally, we have 2014 hit Forest Hills Drive. 2014 Forest Hills Drive is a rap album at its core. J. Cole uses this album to encapsulate his transition into fame and uses his house 2014 Forest Hills Drive as a way to express this and manages to create a sense of relatability in his album, as many of the topics he speaks on can help bring his perspectives down to a lower level that a lot of fans can resonate with. Despite this, I think that J. Cole being labeled as one of the big three is one of the main factors of why this album is meh to me. Immediately, if someone is labeled as one of the big three in all of modern rap, there's gotta be some sort of glaze involved. I also feel like Tyler's take really applies here.
Because everything's performative. Everyone is making these lists just to have people engage. Like, who gives a fuck who the top three is?
Simply because the album is popular and is made by someone who had a track record of creating quote-unquote classic albums, it seems like people will now add this to that list in order to try and fit in and like what everybody else likes. I think that vocal delivery and production on this album are actually what takes away from this rather than the content itself. Even though I'm not that big of a J. Cole fan, I can appreciate his voice and rapping style, but on this project, it seems like he falls into the same flow all too often. A song like January 28th sounds a lot like 03 Adolescence, and while I know that the sound of conscious rap, which is what this is, sounds a certain way, I can't help to feel like that if he switch up his delivery in some of these songs, bring the message out more instead of leaving listeners feel like they're listening to the same song. I mean, he literally does it on songs like Saint Tropez and GOMD, so I'm kind of confused why he didn't do it on more songs on the project. As for production, I think it's solid but can definitely use some work when it comes to beat selection. Just like the flow, I don't think that these beats aid Cole's voice. In fact, I think they tend to sound like droning on at times, which really gets annoying after a while. All in all, 2014 Forest Hills Drive is a conflicting project that, while it does showcase Cole's ability to craft comprehensive and meaningful stories within his music, the way it's delivered can make listeners lose interest easily. From a very critical perspective, Blonde, Starboy, and 2014 Forest Hills Drive could be considered meh albums. If we dig in, does the production, delivery, and content really live up to the hype that people claim it does? I don't really think so. Though these albums do have a lot of high points, I don't think that they stand out enough to be considered outstanding, monumental albums that change the course of music forever. And that's fine. I don't think an album has to be on the edge of innovation to be good. I just think it has to be good enough and build off of its predecessor to stand out in the sea of their other music.